Indeed, O God, the one who is above all other names, speak your truth into our lives this morning. Plant it deep within us. Help it form and shape and recreate us anew into the people that you have called us to be. It's in your name we pray, and all God's people said, Amen. You may be seated. I'm proud of myself this morning because instead of, hiding out back here with the pulpit stand where, isolated from people, I moved forward to be closer to you. So I've come a long way since my childhood. This morning, as we begin, I want to show you some images on the screen. I'm going to have Megan flip through the 3 pictures. I want to know if this game looks familiar to you. You think so? Or perhaps, there's a less physically demanding and grueling version of this game. That's the next one. This requires very little activity. You don't even have to shuffle the cards. And then, of course, there's you can just sit in your lounge chair and play this one, like my grandparents and my parents did too. And I want you to raise your hands if you've ever played some version of this game on these various ways before. Lots of us, yeah. Now, an early reference to this style of game dates back to 1783, where it's described in a German book of games. However, very interestingly, this is described as a competitive card game where multiple players played together. In fact, not only did at least 2 players play this game together always, it was also a spectator sport. Pretty cool, huh? It was a spectator game during which people stood around watching and betting on the outcome. So it began as a game played in community of sorts, right? And then somehow, somewhere along the way, we've turned this game into one that's primarily done alone. Just one solitary individual playing against the cards or the computer, so to speak. Although there isn't really certainty among game historians, yes, there are people whose job is just to study the history of games. There's not certainty about how the game evolved from community to alone, but it happened somehow, and it's fairly fitting that solitaire, it became one of the greatest American time wasters, right? Reporter Josh Levine wrote a decade or so ago, whether spider solitaire, Klondike solitaire, or free cell solitaire, this genre of gaming is the single greatest pastime of American individualism and isolation. Move over, baseball. We've got a new game. Now, the former Surgeon General of the United States declared a loneliness and isolation epidemic during his tenure, signaled by the fact that more than 50% of us, U.S. individuals, identify a persistent feeling of loneliness. Even people with busy, full lives that involve regular interaction with others, calendars, daily agendas, to-do lists filled with work commitments and club memberships, committee and board involvements, extracurricular activities, and yet loneliness and feelings of isolation persist. Unlike depression and anxiety, loneliness has no recognized clinical form, meaning there's no diagnostic criteria for medical professionals to diagnose loneliness or social isolation yet. But clinical psychologist Ellen Hendrickson sees this changing in the future with a clinical diagnosis she's proposed called social isolation syndrome. She explains, in a dizzying number of ways, modern life has allowed us to disengage from one another so we can successfully avoid awkward conversations and interactions. By avoiding these awkward moments, we are also denying ourselves a basic human need of connection and community with others, even strangers. Studies of our physical, mental, emotional, and social health point to this fact. Humans are designed to need community and connection with other human beings to thrive and survive. The addition of a clinical diagnosis will help us call attention to this basic human need and its impact on human health and well-being. She concludes, it may also lead us to a cure for loneliness. In summary, Dr. Hendrickson's word reminds us that we are designed, I dare say, created with the basic need of community and connection with others. And yet we seem to be denying ourselves this basic need. We are becoming a society of solitary silos and isolated individuals, and the impact of this can be seen in every facet of our lives. It seems that somehow, somewhere along the way, we've turned life into one that's primarily done alone, a solitary life. Or maybe, just maybe, this recent science is actually just bringing to light ancient truths. In fact, a long time before the Surgeon General or Dr. Hendrickson or other scientists began giving voice to our need for community and connection and the impact of social isolation and loneliness, long before this, these ancient words stole their thunder. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. Hear them. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun, the case of solitary individuals without children or kin. Yet there is no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. For whom am I toiling, they wonder, and depriving myself of pleasure? This is all so meaningless and miserable. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to the one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, two will withstand one. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Now, before we delve too far into the specifics of these words, we keep in mind that these relatively few verses stand among many more within the pages of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book biblical scholars and theologians know very, very little about. There's uncertainty about who wrote it, but surprise, we do know that it's actually two authors identified within the pages. There's uncertainty about when it was written. There's uncertainty about which people it was written for or about. There are even Hebrew words within this book that are completely unknown, not used in other places, and the best guesses of translators revealing completely different meanings depending on which version of the English Bible you read. Many of the details and facts of this book remain a mystery to us. Yet for all the unknowns and all the uncertainties, the authors seem to proclaim over and over again one clear message. Dr. Peter Enns says it in his excellent podcast, The Bible for Normal People. And the clear message, the refrain of Ecclesiastes is, nothing is the way it's supposed to be. In other words, the authors looked around at that moment in time and identified that things were not as they should be, specifically that people were not as they should be, as God intended them to be. In many ways, Ecclesiastes fits into the category of lament because the entirety of Ecclesiastes is an exercise, one, in telling the truth about the way of things, and two, reminding people how things are supposed to be, diagnosing, to use that language, the current state of people and offering them an alternative antidote, if you will. Here's a quick summary of the way of things according to Ecclesiastes. People were exhausted. People were unhappy. People were discontent. People were lonely and isolated. exhaustion, unhappiness, discontentment, loneliness. This was not the way things were supposed to be for God's people. And the authors didn't stop there. They didn't just name the way things were. They also named the source, the reason, the why of their exhaustion and unhappiness and discontentment and loneliness. According to the authors, these were the natural symptoms caused by misplaced purposes and values and priorities. The values, priorities, and purposes of that ancient society seemed to fit, they said, into three main categories. Some valued superior wisdom above all. They filled their waking hours, used all of their time and energy seeking after greater and greater knowledge and intellect. Some valued moral certainty and righteousness above all. They filled their waking hours, used all their time and energy pursuing and promoting clear labels of right and wrong, good and bad. And some valued work and material wealth above all. They filled their waking hours, used all their time and energy preoccupied with working hard, amassing more and more money and stuff. Wisdom and intellect, moral certainty and righteousness, material wealth and work. 3 different values, purposes, priorities, yet whether a person's calendar was filled with the do lists and the daily agendas and wholly consumed with learning more and acquiring more knowledge, or wholly consumed with spending the day defining and policing behavior and belief, or wholly consumed with work and wealth, the impact of all 3 of those misplaced priorities and values, those misplaced consuming purposes, was the same in everyone. The impact in everyone was exhaustion and unhappiness and discontentment and isolation and loneliness. And that leads us back to chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. Because all of these symptoms show up right there. But the symptoms of isolation and loneliness are the main focus, giving voice to an ancient loneliness epidemic, long before our former Surgeon General, and also prescribing a cure well before Dr. Hendrickson began hoping for one. First, we hear that description, the diagnosis of the epidemic, verses 7 and 8. Hear them again. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. The case of solitary individuals without children or kin. There is no end to all their toil. Their eyes are never satisfied with riches. For whom am I toiling, they wonder, and depriving myself of pleasure? This is all so meaningless and miserable. Now, after reading and hearing those words from our English translations or English version, the case of solitary individuals without children or kin, it seems straightforward, as if these words are giving voice to the plight of individuals with no children or family to speak of. But that reading entirely misses the particulars of this ancient loneliness epidemic. A Hebrew reading reveals a much deeper source of individual isolation and loneliness. And it has absolutely nothing to do with familial status. That word, translated in English as children, has a much broader Hebrew meaning. It means something like young people, dependent children and grandchildren, subjects of a ruler, strangers in need. That is a wide variety of meanings, right? Everything from dependent children of a parent to subjects of a ruler, to strangers in need of help from another. Ultimately, the point here wasn't to call to mind family, but rather to signify people in need of care, people for whatever reason dependent on someone else, children dependent on the care of a parent, subjects dependent on the wisdom of a ruler, strangers dependent on the kindness of another. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun, the case of solitary individuals without people to care for. And that leads us to the next word, read in English, depending on the translation, kin, relatives, brothers, kindred. And again, Hebrew speaks to a broader meaning. It's something like people who share things in common, equal partners, those in a reciprocal relationship. The focus isn't familial relationship, but rather to signify people who are in equal partnership and reciprocal relationships where help and support and encouragement and care are offered back and forth as each has need. A relationship defined by give and take, mutuality and interdependence. These are people you do life with. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun, the case of solitary individuals without people to care for and people to do life with them. Actually, I prefer Eugene Peterson, who unpacks this so much better than I just did. For his biblical paraphrase of this passage in The Message reads this way: I turned my head and saw people on their way to nothingness, solitary people, completely alone. No people to care for, no partners in life, family or friend, yet working obsessively late into the night, compulsively seeking after more and more, and never bothering to ask themselves, why am I working like a dog, never having any fun, and who cares? It's meaningless, miserable. In other words, human loneliness takes root in the absence of two things: the absence of helping, caring for, giving to others, offering of self in community and connection for the good and well-being of another who wouldn't or can't or won't offer anything back, relationships defined by altruism, if you will. And second, the absence of partners, people who offer encouragement and support and care back and forth, community and connection for the good and well-being of each other, relationships defined by mutuality. The authors of Ecclesiastes define the solitary life as the absence of these two types of connection and community. No doubt, their loneliness epidemic, their illness of isolation wasn't an absence of work commitments and club memberships and committee and board involvements and other commitments on their calendars and their to-do lists. On the contrary, the people of Ecclesiastes were described as completely busy, calendars booked totally full, to-do lists a mile long with all the wrong things. Their loneliness stemmed from purposes and values and priorities that prevented relationships of caring for others in need and mutual partnership with others. It seems that somehow, somewhere, long before the 21st century, human beings turned life into something primarily done alone. Solitary life. So after diagnosing this epidemic, naming it, verses 9 to 12 offer a picture of the way things are supposed to be. They offer an antidote, a cure of sorts. Listen again. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up another, but woe to the one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, 2 will withstand one. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. How many of you have heard that passage before, or parts of it somewhere? And I wonder what the chances are that if you've heard that, you heard it in a wedding ceremony. One person covenanting partnership with another, 1 and 1 becoming 2. But in reality, marriage is decidedly not the author's focus here. Part of the confusion comes from that use of numbers, 1 and 1, 2. But numbers for ancient Hebrew authors were almost never about the actual number. We want precision in the English language. We want numbers to be factual representations of the amount of something. But in the Hebrew language, thrives and flourishes in poetic illustration and symbolism. And numbers rarely mean the number. The use of 1 versus 2 is symbolism. 1 symbolizing loneliness and social isolation, the solitary life. 2 symbolizing connection and relationship, the communal life. If, as Dr. Enns says, the refrain or the meaning of Ecclesiastes is nothing is the way it's supposed to be, verses 9 through 12 are giving voice to the way things are supposed to be. The solitary life means more work. But we are designed for the communal life with less work and more blessings. The solitary life leads to struggling through difficult times alone, but we are designed for the communal life with help and encouragement to get through difficult times. The solitary life leads to worry over even the most basic needs of life, like warmth, being fully met. But we are designed for the communal life, where basic daily needs of life are fulfilled. The solitary life is one of vulnerability and adversity, but we are designed for the communal life, which offers endurance and perseverance through adversity. This truth is found not just in these verses, but in the Genesis story, in which God said that it wasn't good for people to be alone. In the covenant story, in which God claimed a community of people, not just an individual. The commandment story, in which God gave guidelines for communal living. And countless other stories in which God commanded and prioritized hospitality and welcome and relationship and community. In other words, the cure, the antidote for loneliness and social isolation is as simple as living into God's creative design for us. It's as easy as redirecting our misplaced pursuits and values, pursuing our created design, the communal life. It's that simple and it's that easy, and yet it's not, right? It's not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an epidemic on our hands that's been going on since about the beginning of the world. Modern day science, ancient day wisdom, and even the evolution of a simple card game seem to point to the truth that while we are designed, I dare say, created with the basic need of community and connection with others, we simply seem to persist in denying ourselves this basic need. We persist at avoiding it. We persist at pushing it away. We persist at filling our calendars and our agendas and our to-do lists and latching on to our technology to avoid deep connection and relationship and community. So much so that Dr. Stephanie Caciapo, director of the Brain Dynamics Lab at the University of Chicago, and a team of scientists are indeed working on a cure for Dr. Ellen Hendrickson's anticipated diagnosis of social isolation syndrome. They're working on an antidote for the loneliness epidemic. And their antidote is in the form of a pill. Pursuing deep community and relational connection is so difficult for us that scientists wonder if the only cure for what ails us is a tiny little pharmaceutical intervention to help counteract the physical, emotional, and mental impact of loneliness and isolation on our health and well-being. In some ways, a pill will allow us to live the solitary life without caution or consequence. But the ancient words of Ecclesiastes and God's original intention for humanity, paired with recent scientific research and discovery, remind us that there's a better solution, a better antidote for what ails us, and that's community, connection. That's enduring the awkwardness and the inconvenience of conversations with people we may not know well. It involves stretching our tolerance of these sorts of situations for the purpose of growing a deeper relationship. It means choosing to look up from our phones or to get off our computers and maybe completely put them away for a while in order to look for opportunities of connection with actual human beings. It means evaluating, examining our calendars, our daily agendas, our to-do lists, and being honest about the values and pursuits and priorities that they reveal, not just letting them get filled with work responsibilities and club memberships and committee and board involvement and extracurricular activities, rather being intentional about pursuing spaces and places and people that encourage community and relational connection with those who need our care, and partners willing to give and receive support and be supported. Over the past few weeks in our country, specifically in our community just this past week really, students, teachers, and staff have gone back into one of the most natural spaces to learn community. Schools, classrooms, playgrounds, cafeterias, community shows up. And it shows up mostly because of students and kids within those walls. So I think it's only right that we see our created design, our impulse for community and connection, the way that God intended us to be, that we see this in action in this very space and place, a school in Dayton, Maine. Please watch.
We're going to end the week at a school where the students have an important lesson for us all. Here's Steve Hardeman on the road.
Ready for cookies?
6-year-old Maury Belanger has a severe hearing impairment, but she's also very much a typical kid. Which is why, when it came time for kindergarten, her parents, Shannon and Matt, were torn. Send her to a school for the deaf?
Yeah, eggs.
Or to the public school here in Dayton, Maine, which was close and convenient.
Okay.
Unfortunately, at the public school, there weren't any other kids like Maury, and support was minimal.
You always think of the bad things, like, are they gonna make fun of her or...
Her fitting in.
Thankfully, we made the right choice.
Mm-hmm.
You can guess what they decided. Or can you? Believe it or not, this is Dayton Consolidated Elementary, the public school, where talking like Maury has become all the rage.
You guys practice sign language? Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Kids here at Dayton have learned multiple things of sign language, so like door, window, carrot, quiet, funny, sad.
What's that? That's not a sign.
I like to do it.
I like to do it too, but it's not a sign.
Obviously, they're not fluent yet, but about a third of the kids here know enough to navigate a kindergarten conversation. Like when Maury didn't notice the line was moving. The girl in the pink told her to walk, followed by the universal sign for, "Way to go, Maury."
And it's not like the administration is mandating this. There is no sign language curriculum. This is bottom-up kindness. Students motivated by nothing more than their own deep desire to connect with this one little girl.
Wow.
What they know, they learn mostly from posters, books, watching Maury's aid, and teaching each other.
They want to do as much as they can for her. We want her to feel comfortable and safe and be able to kind of make friends with her. It's like if you got a gift basket. That's what she is, a little gift basket. Flowers and chocolate. Just a little bundle of joy.
Eventually, Maury's parents say their daughter may need more support services, but they believe all she needs now is what she has here, a loving community.
To know that people just accept her for how she is, she's just gonna succeed because of being at that school.
There are signs of that already. Steve Hartman, on the road, in Dayton, Maine.
She has all that she needs right here, a loving community. Friends, we all do, right here. We have all that we need. May we commit our values, our purposes, our priorities to seeking after that community. And all God's people said, amen.